very comfortable made me feel very comfortable and particularly impressed me with the fact that he was vitally interested in things I had to show him and tell him. The car was so designed that it could be operated entirely by hand. A crowd gathered around to look at the car, and he remarked, I think it is marvelous. All you have to do is touch a button and it moves away, and you can drive it without effort. I think it is grand. I don't know what makes it go. I would love to have the time to tear it down and see how it works. When Roosevelt's friends, associates admired the machine, he said in their presence, Mr. Chamberlain, I certainly appreciate all the time and effort you have spent in developing this car. It is a mighty fine job. He admired the radiator, the special rear vision mirror and clock, the special spotlight, the kind of upholstery, the sitting position of the driver's seat, the special suitcases in the trunk with his monogram on each suitcase. In other words, he took notice of every detail to which he knew I had given considerable thought. He made a point of bringing these various pieces of equipment to the attention of Mrs. Roosevelt, Miss Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, and his secretary. He even brought the old White House porter into the picture by saying, George, you want to take particularly good care of the suitcases. When the driving lesson was finished, the president turned to me and said, Well, Mr. Chamberlain, I have been keeping the Federal Reserve Board waiting 30 minutes. I guess I had better get back to work. I took a mechanic with me to the White House. He was introduced to Roosevelt when he arrived. He didn't talk to the president, and Roosevelt heard his name only once. He was a shy cap and he kept in the background. But before leaving us, the president looked for the mechanic, shook his hand, called him by name, and thanked him for coming to Washington. And there was nothing perfunctory about his thanks. He meant what he said. I could feel that. A few days after returning to New York, I got an autographed photograph of President Roosevelt and a little note of thanks again expressing his appreciation for my assistance. How he found time to do it is a mystery to me. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that one of the simplest, most obvious, and most important ways of gaining goodwill was by remembering names and making people feel important. Yet, how many of us do it? Half of the time, Half the time we are introduced to a stranger, we chat a few minutes and can't even remember his or her name the time we say goodbye. One of the lessons a politician learned is this: to recall a voter's name is statesmanship, to forget it is oblivion. And the ability to remember names is almost as important in business and social contacts as it is in politics. Napoleon III, Emperor of France and nephew of the great Napoleon, boasted that in spite of all his royal duties, he could remember the name of every person he met. His technique? Simple. If he didn't hear the name distinctly, he said, So sorry, I didn't get the name clearly. Then, if it was an unusual name, he would say, How is it spelled? During the conversation, he took the trouble to repeat the name several times, and he tried to associate in his mind with the person's features, expression, and general appearance. If the person was someone of importance, Napoleon went to even further pains as soon as His Royal Highness was alone. He wrote the name down in a piece of paper. He looked at it, concentrated on it, fixed it securely in his mind, and then tore up the paper. In this way, he gained an eye impression of the name as well as an ear impression. All this takes time, but good manners, said Emerson, are made up of petty sacrifices. The importance of remembering and using names is not just the prerogative of kings and corporate executives. It works for all of us. Ken Nottingham, an employee of General Motors in Indiana, usually had lunch at the company cafeteria. He noticed that the woman who worked behind the counter always had a scowl on her face. She had been making sandwiches for about 2 hours, and I was just another sandwich to her. I told her what I wanted. She weighed out the ham on a little scale, then she gave me one leaf of lettuce, a few potato chips, and handed them to me. The next day, I went through the same line, same woman, same scowl. The only difference was I noticed her name tag. I smiled and said, "Hello, in use," and then told her what I wanted. Well, she forgot the scale, piled on the ham, gave me 3 leaves of lettuce, and heaped on the potato chips until they fell off the plate. We should be aware of the magic contained in a name and realize that the single item is wholly and completely owned by the person with whom we are dealing and nobody else. The name sets the individual apart. It makes him or her unique among all others. The information we are imparting or the request we are making takes on a special importance when we approach the situation with the name of the individual. From the waitress to the senior executive, the name will work magic as we deal with others. Principle 3. Remember that a person's name is to that person and the sweetest and the most important sound in any language. Yeah. An easy way to become a good conversationalist. Some time ago, I attended a bridge party. I don't play bridge, and there was a woman there who didn't play bridge either. She had discovered that I had once been Lowell Thomas' manager before he went on the radio, and that I had traveled in Europe a great deal while helping him prepare the illustrated travel talks he was then delivering. So she said, "Oh, Mr. Carnage, I do want you to tell me about all the wonderful places you have visited and the sights you have seen." As we sat down on the sofa, she remarked that she and her husband had recently returned from a trip to Africa. "Africa?" I exclaimed. "How interesting. I've always wanted to see Africa, but I never got there except for a 24-hour stay once in Algiers. Tell me, did you visit the big game country?" "Yes." "How fortunate. I envy you. Do tell me about Africa." That kept her talking for 45 minutes. She never again asked me where I had been or what I had seen. She didn't want to hear me talk about my travels. All she wanted was an interested listener so she could expand her ego and tell about where she had been. Was she unusual? No. Many people are like that. For example, I met a distinguished botanist at a dinner party given by a New York book publisher. I had never talked with a botanist before, and I found him fascinating. I literally sat on the edge of my chair and listened while he spoke of exotic plants and experiments in developing new forms of plant life and indoor gardens, and even told me astonishing facts about the humble potato. I had a small indoor garden of my own. He was good enough to tell me how to solve some of my problems. As I said, we were at a dinner party. There must have been a dozen of other guests. But I violated the canons of courtesy, ignored everyone else, talked for hours to the botanist. Midnight came, I said goodnight to everyone and departed. The botanist then turned to our host and paid me several flattering compliments. I was most stimulating, I was this and I was that, and he ended by saying I was the most interesting conversationalist. An interesting conversationalist. Why? I had hardly said anything at all. I couldn't have said anything if I had wanted to without changing the subject, for I didn't know any more about botany than I knew about the anatomy of penguin. But I had done this. I had listened intently. I had listened because I was genuinely interested and he felt it. Naturally, that pleased him. That kind of listening is one of the highest compliments we can pay anyone. Few human beings, wrote Jack Woodford in Strangers in Love. Few human beings approve against the implied flattery of rapt attention. I went even further than giving him rapt attention. I was hearty in my approbation and lavish in my praise. I told him that I had been immensely entertained and instructed, and I had. I told him I wished I had his knowledge, and I did. I told him that I should love to wander the fields with him, and I have. I told him I must see him again, and I did. And I had him thinking of me as a good conversationalist when in reality I had been merely a good listener and encouraged him to talk. What is the secret? The mystery of a successful business interview. Well, according to former Harvard president Charles W. Eliot, there is no mystery about successful business intercourse. Exclusive attention to the person who is speaking to you is very important. Nothing else is so flattering as that. Eliot himself was a past master of the art of listening. Henry James, one of America's first great novelists, recalled Dr. Eliot's listening was not mere silence, but a form of activity. Sitting every erect on the end of his spine, white hands joined in his lap, making no movement except that he revolved his thumb around each other faster or slower, he faced his interlocutor and seemed to be hearing with his eyes as well as ears. He listened with his mind and attentively considered what you had to say while you said it. At the end of an interview, the person who had talked to him felt that he had had his say. Self evident, isn't it? You don't have to study for 4 years in Harvard to discover that. Yet I know, and you know, department store owners who will rent expensive space, but they buy their goods economically, dress their windows appealingly. Yeah, I'm so sorry for that. You don't have to study for 4 years in Harvard to discover that. Yet I know, and you know, department store owners who will rent expensive space, buy their goods economically, dress their windows appealingly, spend thousands of dollars in advertising, and then hire clerks who haven't the sense to be good listeners. Clerks who interrupt customers, contradict them, irritate them, and all but drive them from the store. A department store in Chicago almost lost a regular customer who spent several $1,000s each year in the store because the sales clerk wouldn't listen. Mr. Mrs. Henrietta Douglas, who took our course in Chicago, had purchased a coat at a special sale. After she had brought it home, she noticed that there was a tear in the lining. She came back the next day and asked the sales clerk to exchange it. The clerk refused even to listen to her complaint. You bought this at a special sale, she said. She pointed to a sign on the wall. Read that. Read that, she exclaimed. All sales are final. Once you brought it, you have to keep it. Sew up the lining yourself. But this was damaged merchandise, Mrs. Douglas complained. Makes no difference, the clerk interrupted. Final's final. Mrs. Douglas was about to walk out indignantly, swearing never to return to that store ever. When she was greeted by the department manager, who knew her from her many years of patronage, Mrs. Douglas told her what had happened. The manager listened attentively to the whole story, examined the coat, and then said, Special sales are final, so we can dispose of merchandise and at the end of season. But this no return policy does not apply to damaged goods. We will certainly replace or repair the lining, or if you prefer, give you your money back. What a difference in treatment. If that manager had not come along and listened to the customer, a long term patron of that store could have been lost forever. Listening is just as important in one's home life as in the world of business. Millie Esposito of Croton Hudson, New York, made it to her business to listen carefully when one of her children wanted to speak with her. One evening, she was sitting in the kitchen with her son Robert, and after a brief discussion of something that was on his mind, Robert said, Mom, I know that you love me very much. Mrs. Esposito was touched and said, Of course I love you very much. Did you doubt it? Robert responded, No, but I really know you love me because whenever I want to talk to you about something, you stop whatever you're doing and listen to me. The chronic kicker, even the most violent critic, will frequently soften and be subdued in the presence of a patient, sympathetic listener, a listener who will be silent while the irate fault finder dilates like a king cobra and spews the poison out of his system. To illustrate, the New York Telephone Company discovered a few years ago that it had to deal with one of the most vicious customers who ever cursed a customer service representative. And he did curse. He raved. He threatened to tear the phone He threatened to tear the phone out by its roots. He refused to pay certain charges that he declared were false. He wrote letters to the newspapers, he filed innumerable complaints with the Public Service Commission, and he started several suits against the telephone company. At last, one of the company's most skillful troubleshooters was sent to interview the stormy patrol. This troubleshooter listened and let the cantankerous customer enjoy himself, pouring out his tirade. The telephone representative listened and said yes and sympathized with his grievance. He raved on and I listened for nearly 3 hours. The troubleshooter said he related his as he related his experiences before one of the author's classes. Then I went back and listened some more. I interviewed him 4 times, and before the fourth visit was over, I had become a charter member of an organization he was starting. He called it the Telephone Subscribers Protection Protective Association. I am still a member of this organization, and so far as I know, I am the only member in the world today besides Mr. I listened and sympathized with him on every point that he made during these interviews. He had never had a telephone representative talk with him that way before, and he became almost friendly. The point on which I went to see him was not even mentioned on the first visit, nor was it mentioned in the second or third, but upon the fourth interview, I closed the case completely. He paid all his bills in full. For the first time in the history of his difficulties with the telephone company, he voluntarily withdrew his complaints from the Public Service Commission. Doubtless, Mr. had considered himself a holy crusader, defending the public rights against callous exploitation. But in reality, what he had really wanted was a feeling of importance. He got this feeling of importance at first by kicking and complaining. But as soon as he got his feeling of importance from a representative of the company, his imagined grievances vanished into thin air. One morning, years ago, an angry customer stormed in the office of Julian F. Detmer, founder of the Detmer Woolen Company, which later became the world's largest distributor of woolens to the tailoring trade. This man owed us a small sum of money. Mr. Detmer explained to me. The customer denied it, but we knew he was wrong. So a credit department had insisted that he pay. After getting a number of letters from a credit department, he packed a script, made a trip to Chicago, and hurried into my office to inform me not only that he was not going to pay that bill, but he was never going to buy another dollar's worth of goods from the Detmer Woolen Company. I listened patiently to all he had to say. I was tempted to interrupt, but I realized that would be bad policy, so I let him talk himself out. When he finally simmered down and got in a receptive mood, I said quietly, I want to thank you for coming to Chicago to tell me about this. You have done me a great favor. For if our credit department has annoyed you, it may annoy other good customers. That would be just too bad. Believe me, I'm far more eager to hear this man than you are to tell it. That was the last thing in the world he expected me to say. I think I think he was a trifle disappointed because he had to come to Chicago to tell me a thing or two. But here I was thanking him instead of scrapping with him. I assured him we would wipe the charge off the books and forget it, because he was a very careful man with only one account to look after, while our clerks had to look after thousands. Therefore, he was less likely to be wrong than we were. I told him that I understood exactly how he felt and that if I were in his shoes, I should undoubtedly feel precisely as he said. Since he wasn't going to buy from us anymore, I recommended some other woolen houses. In the past, we had usually lunched together when he came to Chicago, so I invited him to have lunch with me this day. He accepted reluctantly, but when we came back to the office, he placed a larger, older order than ever before. He returned home in a softened mood and wanting to be just as fair with us as we had been with him, looked over his bills, found one that had been mislaid, and sent us a check with his apologies. Later, when his wife presented him with a baby boy, he gave his son in the middle of he gave his son the middle name of Detmer, and he remained a friend and customer of the house until his death 22 years afterwards. Years ago, a poor Dutch immigrant boy washed the windows of a bakery shop after school to help support his family. His people were so poor that in addition, he used to go out on the street with a basket every day and collect stray bits of coal that had fallen in the gutter where the coal wagons had delivered fuel. That boy, Edward Bok, never got more than 6 years of schooling in his life. Yet eventually he made himself one of the most successful magazine editors in the history of American journalism. How did he do it? That is a long story, but how he got his start can be told briefly. He got his start by using the principles advocated in this chapter. He left school when he was 13 and became an office boy for Western Union. But he didn't do for one but he didn't do for one moment give up but he didn't for one moment give up the idea of an education. Instead, he started to educate himself. He saved his car fares and went without lunch until he had enough money to buy an encyclopedia of American biography. And then he did an unheard of thing. He read the lives of famous people and wrote them asking for additional information about their childhoods. He was a good listener. He asked famous people to tell him more about themselves. He wrote General James A. Garfield, who was then running for president, and asked if it was true that he was once a tow boy on a canal, and Garfield replied. He wrote General Grant asking about a certain battle, and Grant drew a map for him and invited this 14-year-old boy to dinner and spent the evening talking to him. Soon, our Western Union messenger boy was corresponding with many of the most famous people in the nation: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Longfellow, Miss Abraham Lincoln, Lucia May Alcott, General Sherman, and Jefferson Davis. Not only did he correspond with these distinguished people, but as soon as he got a vacation, he visited many of them as a welcome guest in their homes. This experience imbued him with a confidence that was invaluable. These men and women fired him with a vision and ambition that shaped his life. And all these, let me repeat, was made possible solely by the application of the principles we are discussing here. Isaac F. Marcuson, a journalist who interviewed hundreds of celebrities, declared that many people fail to make a favorable impression because they don't listen attentively. They have been so much concerned with what they're going to say next that they do not keep their ears open. Very important people have told me that they prefer good listeners to good talkers, but the ability to listen seems rarer than almost any other good trait. And not only important personages crave a good listener, but ordinary folk do too. As the Reader's Digest once said, many persons call a doctor when all they want is an audience. Yeah. During the darkest hours of the Civil War, Lincoln wrote to old friend in Springfield, Illinois, asking him to come to Washington. Lincoln said he had some problems he wanted to discuss with him. The old neighbor called at the White House, and Lincoln talked to him for hours about the advisability of issuing a proclamation freeing the slaves. Lincoln went all over the arguments for and against such a move, and then read letters and newspaper articles, some denouncing him for not freeing the slaves, and others denouncing him for fear he was going to free them. After talking for hours, Lincoln shook hands with his old neighbor, said good night, and sent him back to Illinois without even asking for his opinion. Lincoln had done all the talking himself that seemed to clarify his mind. He seemed to feel easier after the talk, the old friend said. Lincoln hadn't wanted advice. He had wanted merely a friendly, sympathetic listener to whom he could unburden himself. That's what we all want when we are in trouble. It is frequently all the irritated customer wants and the dissatisfied employee or the hurt friend. One of the great listeners of modern times was Sigmund Freud. A man who met Freud described his manner of listening. It struck me so forcibly that I shall never forget him. He had qualities which I had never seen in any other man. Never had I seen such concentrated attention. There was none of the piercing, penetrating gaze business. His eyes were mild and genial. His voice was low and kind. His gestures were few, but the attention he gave me, his appreciation of what I said, even when I said it badly, was extraordinary. You have no idea what it meant to be listened like that. If you want to know how to make people shun you and laugh at you behind your back, and even despise you, here is the recipe. Never listen to anyone for long. Talk incessantly about yourself. If you have an idea while the other person is talking, don't wait for him or her to finish. Burst right in and interrupt in the middle of a sentence. Do you know people like that? I do, unfortunately. And the astonishing part of it is that some of them are prominent. Bores, that is all they are. Bores intoxicated with their own egos, drunk with a sense of their own importance. People who talk only of themselves, who think only of themselves. And those who think only of themselves, Dr. Nicholas Murray Butler, longtime president of Columbia University said, are hopelessly uneducated. They're not educated, said Butler, no matter how instructed they may be. So, if you aspire to be a good conversationalist, be an attentive listener. To be interesting, be interested. Ask questions that other persons will enjoy answering. Encourage them to talk about themselves and their accomplishments. Remember that remember that the people you're talking to are 100 times more interested in themselves and their wants and problems than they are in you and your problems. A person's toothache means more to that person than a famine in China which kills 1 million people. A ball on one's neck in shreds, one more than 40 earthquakes in Africa. Think of the next time you start a conversation. Principle 4, be a good listener, encourage others to talk about themselves. I think we'll stop here for today. Uh, I think next chapter could be continued tomorrow. So I would like to hear today's takeaways from each one of you. Who would like to volunteer first? Hello? Hello? Is anyone ready to tell today's takeaways? Would anyone like to volunteer?
How about you, Taranjit? Do you have anything to say about it?
Yeah, I think so. I was waiting if Girish or Chandrasekhar would speak up. Yeah. The first thing that the name thing that we discussed last week also, that is a very effective way of addressing people. If you address anybody by name, even you meet them after years, that gives a sense of belongingness to you, to them. Sorry, they feel that yes, the person is very much interested. That after so many years, also they have remembered us. And the art of conversationalist, being a good conversationalist, you have to be a very good listener. It requires a lot of patience, because many a times what happens, people go on and on and on and they don't stop. As we have discussed in the lesson also, that so many, if you are good at listening and you have that patience, you can turn problems into opportunities. So being a good conversationalist, the first thing is that you have to be a good listener. You have to develop that quality of listening.
Yes.
Right.
And
That was
yes, thank you. Sorry, Tejshri, I thought let me just come and help you with a little.
Yeah, sure. The thing is, today is a bit like it's a bit chaotic. I'm really sorry for the mess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
How about Girish and Chandrasekhar? Any, both of them are on mute. Okay. I think if they have no great. Okay, yes, Chandrasekhar, we're waiting for you. Chandrasekhar. Okay. Looks like they're having some kind of an issue with their
Network,
audio.
right? Yeah, I think their audio is on, but I think he just joined again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, ma'am, I'm audible.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, ma'am. But in the system, audible voice recording not there. I'm using again mobile. As ma'am in this chapter, I like this person they left when 13 and became office boy. He said he not for one moment give up that idea of an education. He started to educate himself. He saved his care face, went to without lunch. His story is like a inspiration story, ma'am. After he left at the 13 age, he became and again he studied, he educated himself, and he read the lives of people, famous people, wrote and asked them for additional information for their childhoods. Like he became a good listener. uh, how that person fight themselves and how educate himself in that in 13 age. And contact so many famous people at that age also, ma'am. I take as an inspiration. In that age, he did something achievement.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It is truly inspiring. It is truly inspiring. It actually shows you what one can do when you make your mind up. And when you, uh, do affirmation, when you do actions, the universe also will want to help you. When you want to help yourself, the universe will step in to help you. Right? We call universe, some people call God, some people called God, some people call universe, some people called higher power, whatever. Anybody will this thing. That's exactly what that has happened in that story. And it truly is inspiring. No doubt about it. Girish, would you like to speak?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
There was one principle, it was stated in the chapter, if you don't do this, you're headed for trouble. Like when you talking to a person, like we have to if we mention the name, then we will be benefited. Like there was one a story or scenario, like asking for a sandwich. Like in first case, like he was not being called with a name, but when they called with a name, he added some extra things to that and gave. So when we are dealing with people, so it's about how we care them and love them. So when we are talking with them, we have to be kind, and we have to like show interest that we are uh, like interested in them, like that.
True. So what happens is, Girish, what he's trying to tell is you should show genuine interest.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when
Yes.
you remember a person's name, that means you give them that much importance.
Yes, ma'am.
When they're working in places where they don't even remember the name of the person, they feel lost. They feel that they're not important. And anybody who gives them importance, they will respect that person.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I think we can close the meeting.
Yeah, I think. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So
Yes.
we close the meeting. Good night, everybody. Thank you. And sorry if there's been some kind of an issue.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night,
Thank
night,
you for
all
everyone.
of
taking
you.
Thanks,
Thank
ma'am.
you. Thank
Good
you for
night, ma'am.
coming.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good
Thank you, ma'am.
night.
thank
Good
you.
night.